Okay, so we all know the classic nativity scene, right? You got baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and of course the three wise men, the Magi, showing up with their gifts. But what if I told you that a lot of what we think we know about the Magi is like kind of filtered through this Western lens?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, how much more there is to the story when you look at it from other perspectives.
Right. Like, for instance, have you ever thought about maybe there being like 12 Magi instead of just three? Or maybe they didn't even get there until Jesus was a toddler.
Yeah, those are just some of the little things that we'll be getting into today.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the book, The Magi in Aramaic Tradition, A Journey to the Christ Child.
It's really a great resource to learn more about the Magi.
Okay, so let's just start with like who these Magi were. I mean, we always just call them Magi, but in Aramaic, they're actually known as Magoshe. So what's the difference there?
Well, that term Magoshe, I think it shows us a little more about them. It means more than just being wise. It also means they had like a specific religious standing. So like they weren't just, wise men like we think of them today. They were important people in their culture.
Interesting. So where were they from then? Were they really kings, like some people say?
Well, it's still up for debate exactly where they were in society, but it's likely they were from the Parthian or maybe the Persian empires, and some even think they could have had some connection to Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism. Never really thought about that connection before. What's so interesting about that?
Well, with Zoroastrianism, astronomy and astrology were really big deals, right? So that makes their take on the star, or kokaba, as it's called in Aramaic, even more interesting.
So they weren't just like following some random bright light. They were actually using all this knowledge they had to figure out what it meant.
Exactly. They were searching for the truth.
Which, actually, that leads us to something else interesting. Syriac tradition says that the Magi were fulfilling some Old Testament prophecies. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So in Isaiah, for example, it talks about all the nations coming together to worship the Messiah. And in Syriac tradition, the Magi represent that, like all these nations coming together.
So it wasn't just some random event. It was actually part of this bigger, spiritual plan.
Yeah, exactly. You could say their journey kind of shows how history and divine purpose can, come together.
I got to ask about something I always see on those Christmas cards. The ones with the Magi riding camels.
Yeah.
Did they really ride camels?
Well, this is where things get pretty cool, actually. Syriac texts say that the Magi were on horses, not camels. And there's actually more to that than you might think.
Horses, huh?
Yeah.
So why would that matter so much?
Well, back then, horses were a big symbol of royal power, and they're fast, right? Which makes sense when you think about their mission. They were going to see a newborn king.
Ah, that makes sense. It changes the whole picture. Instead of this slow caravan, it's more like this big procession of horses coming in.
Yeah, it definitely has more of a majestic feel to it. And it really reinforces the idea that they weren't just some wise guys. They were representatives of a king going to see another king.
So speaking of their arrival, there's another interesting thing about Syriac and Eastern traditions. When they say the Magi got there, we always picture them showing up right after Jesus is born. But that might not be the whole story, is it?
That's right. According to these traditions, the Magi might have actually visited Jesus when he was a toddler, not a newborn baby.
A toddler. So not the manger scene we always think of.
Maybe not, no. It's possible the star led them to a house instead.
Wow, that really changes how you think about the story. It's amazing how looking at these different traditions can give you a whole new perspective.
And it gets even more interesting when you look at how many Magi there were. Syriac tradition says there were actually 12, not 3.
12. Wow, that's a big difference. And they each had their own names.
Yep. Hormizd, Yazdegerd, Peroz, just to name a few.
Yeah.
And each name has cultural and historical significance, maybe showing the different regions they came from.
Hormizd, Yazdegerd. Those are some pretty cool names. It's amazing to think about all the different cultures that were probably a part of this.
It really is. It shows how rich the ancient world was and how connected everything was even back then.
Okay, so we've got 12 Magi with these unique names, riding horses, and maybe even getting there when Jesus was a toddler. So what about the star itself? Was it just like a normal star or something more?
Well, that's a question that people have been thinking about for a long time. In Aramaic texts, the star isn't described as just some random object in the sky. It was a miraculous sign.
So not just like a comet or a bright star, but something more divine.
Exactly. It might even be similar to the Shekinah in Jewish tradition.
Now, I got to admit, I'm not really familiar with the Shekinah. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Of course. It's a Kind of a complicated concept, but basically the Shekinah is like the presence of God, where God is, and it's often connected to light or glory.
So this star that led the Magi, it could have been like God's presence leading them to Jesus.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it from the Aramaic point of view. So it's not just something scientific. It's this powerful symbol of, divine guidance.
That really adds a whole new level to the story. And speaking of symbolism, what about those gifts, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh? What do they really mean?
Each gift has a really deep meaning, actually. The gold was like acknowledging Jesus as King of Kings. And frankincense, well, it smells good, and it was used in religious ceremonies, so it represented his divinity.
And the myrrh, that one always seemed a little weird for a baby gift.
Yeah, well, myrrh was often used for burials and stuff. It might seem a bit gloomy, but it foreshadowed, that Jesus would die and suffer.
Wow, so even in the gifts, we see this idea that Jesus was both a king and a savior.
Exactly. The gifts weren't just stuff they brought. They were kind of like pronouncements about who Jesus was and what would happen to him.
I feel like I'm seeing the whole nativity story in a totally new light.
And we've just barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to the Magi's story. So we've been talking about the Magi from these Aramaic and Syriac traditions, and it's clear there's more to their story than we usually hear, right?
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about how much we might miss when we only focus on one perspective.
And that's what's so cool about looking at these other traditions. It's like seeing something familiar in a whole new way.
That reminds me, we were talking about the Magi arriving when Jesus was a toddler. What do you think that means, arriving later like that?
That's a really good question. Some people think it might be to emphasize, that Jesus was human too. Like by the time they got there, he wasn't a tiny baby anymore. He was growing up like a normal kid.
So it shows that he was divine, but he also experienced life as a human being.
Exactly. And in the Syriac tradition, that's a big deal. It's called the incarnation, the idea that God became human in Jesus.
It also changes how we think about the manger scene, doesn't it? It's not just about that one moment. It's about Jesus's whole life.
Right. And the Magi's journey, it's like a metaphor for our own spiritual journeys.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, they were searching for something, right? Answering a call. They had challenges, uncertainties, but in the end, they found what they were looking for.
I see what you mean. It's like that human desire for something bigger than ourselves, looking for truth and meaning.
Exactly. And it's about the changes we go through along the way. The Magi, they left everything familiar. They went into the unknown, just trusting their faith.
It's pretty brave when you think about it. No maps, no GPS. They were going by the stars and what they felt inside.
They relied on something much deeper. Faith, intuition, and that star guiding them. They trusted in something beyond what they could see, and it led them to where they needed to be.
It makes you wonder what they talked about on that journey. Did they have doubts? What kind of challenges did they face?
It would be fascinating to know, wouldn't it? Imagine them discussing what the star meant, sharing their hopes and fears, keeping each other going. They were in it together, discovering their faith along the way.
And they weren't just watching it happen, right? They were making decisions, interpreting signs, and then offering these valuable gifts to the king.
Yeah, their journey was an act of devotion, like a pilgrimage. And those gifts, we talked about their meaning, they chose them carefully.
We did talk about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I wonder what people thought about those gifts. How did they react?
Think about Mary and Joseph. Regular people suddenly given gifts fit for royalty. It must have been overwhelming, but also a sign that their baby was truly special.
It's like their faith was confirmed, a sign that they were part of something bigger.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the value of the gift. They had a deeper spiritual meaning, too.
All right, the gold for Jesus' kingship, the frankincense for his divinity, and the myrrh, even though it seems sad, it pointed towards his sacrifice.
That's it, this paradox of recognizing both his glory and his suffering.
It reminds me that real leaders often have to sacrifice, that true greatness comes from serving others, being humble. It seems like the Magi understood that from the start.
Their gifts weren't just for Jesus, they were for all of us. A symbol of love, respect, devotion. They saw the divine in Jesus, and by extension, the divine in all of us.
That's a powerful message, especially today when it feels like everyone's focused on looks and money. The Magi remind us that true wealth is about what's inside, the spiritual part.
And that kind of wealth, everyone can have it, no matter where you come from, your status, your beliefs. The Magi, they came from different cultures, a different religion, but they were drawn to the light of Christ.
It really shows that Christ's message is for everyone. And their story keeps inspiring us all these years later. We even have a celebration for them, the Feast of the Epiphany.
Yes, Epiphany, or in Aramaic, Epiphania, which means revealing Christ to the world, like when the Magi arrived. It celebrates light, hope, and the divine inside all of us.
And it's so interesting how the Magi are often shown in art, especially in Syriac traditions.
Absolutely. They appear in beautiful ancient Syriac icons, often in these bright Eastern clothes, their horses all decked out. It really captures how grand and important their journey was.
It's like they're stepping out of time, showing us that their message still matters today. They're telling us to find our own stars, to follow truth and love.
And the gifts we give, they don't have to be physical things. They can be kindness, compassion, anything from the heart.
It's about sharing our light, doing what we can to make the world better. The Magi weren't just watching, they were taking action. They want us to do the same.
Exactly. We need to engage with our own faith, to search for truth, to be the best we can be, and to recognize that divine spark within us and in everyone we meet.
That's something to remember all the time, not just at Christmas. The Magi teach us that faith is a journey, and it's full of discovery, change, and giving back.
And just like the Magi's journey led them to things they didn't expect, our own journeys can surprise us and teach us profound things.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The symbolism, the cultural stuff, the spiritual meaning of the Magi's journey.
And we've seen how these other traditions can challenge what we thought we knew and give us a deeper understanding of this familiar story.
But there's always more to discover, isn't there? The Magi's story is full of inspiration and meaning.
It really is. Their journey is timeless, their message eternal. As we continue on our own journeys, let's remember the wisdom, the courage, and the devotion of the Magi.
What a great thought. So thinking back on everything we've talked about with the Magi, it's really interesting how they're like a bridge between the East and the West, different cultures and religions. They weren't just there in the Christmas story, they were a big part of God's plan.
Yeah, they were pioneers, you could say, showing that a world where we celebrate differences, not fear them, is possible. Their story tells us that truth can be found in surprising places and that wisdom comes from all kinds of sources.
That's a really important reminder for us today, don't you think? Especially when things feel so divided. The Magi teach us to be humble, listen to each other, and recognize that everyone has value.
Definitely. Their journey also shows us that it's okay to look for guidance outside ourselves, to trust in something bigger. They followed that star, a sign from God, and it took them to a humble stable where the king was born.
It's like a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight, and that being humble can lead to amazing things. And speaking of giving, the Magi didn't just receive gifts, they gave them too. They understood that real generosity is about giving, not getting, offering what you have to the world. The gold, frankincense, and myrrh weren't just valuable, they were symbols from their hearts. They recognized who Jesus was, both divine and human.
It wasn't about the material stuff, it was about understanding Jesus. The gold for his kingship, the frankincense for his divinity, and even the myrrh, which seems kind of sad, pointed to his sacrifice. They knew that real leaders often have to sacrifice, and that greatness comes from serving and being humble.
It reminds us that we all have something to give, whether it's our time, our talents, or just being there for someone. The Magi inspire us to share our light, to use what we have to make things better.
And it doesn't have to be something huge or fancy. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness or understanding can make the biggest difference. The Magi show us that every act of love, every time we're truly there for someone, it all adds up.
It's like we're all part of this big story, and each of us has a role to play. The Magi invite us to be part of it, with courage, humility, and open hearts, to follow our own stars, search for truth, be our best selves, and see that spark of the divine in each other.
Their journey shows us how powerful faith is, how searching can change us, and how hope can last for centuries and across cultures.
So, as we think about the Magi, let's ask ourselves, what's our guiding star? What are we giving to the world? How can we be more open, generous, and humble like they were?
Those are great questions to think about, not just at Christmas, but all year round. The Magi's journey shows us that searching for truth is a lifelong adventure, and the rewards are amazing.
Well, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of the Magi, but their story will keep inspiring us. May their journey help us to find greater understanding, compassion, and love.
And may we all have the courage to follow our own stars wherever they lead us.